So yes, we are open for discussion. I might take 2 seconds to fiddle with the sound a little bit. But go ahead and ask questions. We also have questions coming in from the discussion board and also from Twitter. So
also from
Twitter.
Oh, okay. Great.
We're tweeting.
I don't have a question while Katie's sorting out the technology. Or just a reaction, that would be fine as well, doesn't have to be.
Probably as loud as it's going to go without overdriving. Okay. So, questions?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for your talk and the
you.
series as well. So would epistemological discourse then be sort of like a quality control almost, in a way? Or is that too...
Yeah, no, that's a nice way of thinking about it. I think that's well, let me say that's one reason it's important, yeah. So I think for some of us, we're interested in these epistemological issues for their own sake, but that's not for everybody. But I think the way in which it's important for other researchers who don't take that as their main focus is to think, well, it's useful to keep an eye on what you're doing, your methodology, why am I using these arguments, why am I using this kind of evidence, is this really going to get me the kind of standard of knowledge that I'm seeking? So a little bit like, the case with the epistemology of medicine, I guess, illustrates that in some ways, right? So those are important issues, like how can we really know whether a certain drug or therapy or intervention is effective? Do we have to have a randomized controlled trial, or can we have knowledge about that? That's really important exactly for quality control, as you were saying, because these trials are big and expensive, and there's always somebody that doesn't get the intervention, and there are kind of tragic stories there as well. So this is one of particular interest, but I mean, particularly there are lots of issues there around how seriously we take kind of patients and anecdotal experiences on. Can we take that as part of knowledge of medicine? And I think those are really important practical questions, and they are. I think thinking about that as quality control for medical research is a nice way of thinking about that. And I would hope also in the Arts Humanities as well, so where we're all pursuing our research. We've got our own concerns, but how taking a moment to reflect on what we think we're doing and what standards are we applying, and are we living up to the standards that we want to apply to ourselves, I think is very useful. Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask you to repeat briefly
the question?
Yeah, just for my. I have a question from our discussion board.
Great.
So here we go. The question is this: where does good faith knowledge fit in the dichotomy between knowledge and belief? So, for example, if I genuinely believe that I know myself to be adopted or not adopted, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So in a way, this is why I said, well, let's not think about this in the first person, right? Because it's trickier. Let's think about someone else and think, do we see someone else that I've imagined, and she thinks she's adopted and so on. But of course, we want to know what to do in our own case, right? So I find I have these beliefs, and how do I tell which of my beliefs count as knowledge, right? So I didn't know. I mean, the two things to say, I think. So one is that there's no recipe here, right? Of course, these are things that we agonize over in our own case. What do I really know? How sure am I? If you've ever had to make a kind of big decision about something, of course, there isn't a philosopher can't tell you how to tell in each case what you know and what you don't know. But just to step back from that a little bit, it's also, I think, helpful to think about blame and praise in these cases. So sometimes we see people believing things on grounds that we think are frivolous or unreasonable. We feel, not that there's something ethically wrong necessarily, but we say, well, look, that's unreasonable, it's irrational, there's something problematic about that. Whereas other times, we look at someone else's beliefs and say, well, look, I think she's wrong, but you can see why she thinks that. That's what I would believe in those circumstances, perfectly reasonable. The person hasn't done anything wrong, they're just kind of lucky in some sense. And I think that that's the way to think about one's own case as well. You can't sort of look outside and do a sort of independent check on which of your beliefs are right or not. But what you can do is sort of reflect in your own case about, well, I'm believing this in good faith. Is it just faith? What evidence have I got? What reasons can I draw upon? And that's what you can do in your own case. But in a way, that's why it's important to, again, come back to the social character of knowledge, is that we talk to each other, we compare reasons for things, and we exchange evidence. Often, and I'm sure we've all had this experience, especially in relationships, like you come to a belief and you really feel it strongly, and yet at the same time you don't know whether you're being reasonable or not, and that's when you call your friend. Right? So I think that actually we do what we can from the first person perspective, but often that's why social interaction is important. And not just when you're thinking about your friends, but also in a research context. Right? This is another reason why we exchange our ideas and our research, and we present our work in progress, and we give our work for other people to read. It's exactly that kind of quality control idea again, is that you can't always tell from the inside of your project whether you're being reasonable or not, and other people can, if they're generous and kind people, can help you out with that.
I have more from the board, but is there a question in the room?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your lecture. Nice talk. But here I'd like to ask about epistemology, where there are two ontologies. One ontology, okay, or there are more than one ontology. How can epistemology, okay, approach these different ontologies?
Do you have an example in mind, or?
Well, as a researcher, there are two kinds of researchers, okay, a qualitative or a quantitative researcher. Okay, so the qualitative usually wants to or intends to understand more than to explain the ontology, and he has more than one real knowledge, and he's among all of these, and he should participate, right? Whereas the objective, the quantitative, just is outside, okay. So here we have two kinds of researchers, two kinds of approaches of researching. So my question about epistemology as an umbrella, okay, how can epistemology approaches these two approaches?
Yeah, okay, so for the case the Mike didn't pick that up, the question was really, well, there are a number of issues, but one issue I took from that was the question about, when we have different methodologies for studying the same kind of stuff, how to reconcile or how to think about that. But also that some research approaches or some research methods involve us in thinking of kind of ontology in a sort of multiple way and recognizing there are multiple realities without having to sort of choose between them. So perhaps in anthropology that some of these issues might resonate. What shall I say? Maybe this brings us to the difference between epistemology and epistemology of, right? So all those things that I listed there, sort of epistemology of the Large Hadron Collider, or epistemology of the closet, or epistemology of technology, and so on, there are going to be quite different things to say in those different cases. So depending on what our domain is, what our subject matter is, there are going to be interestingly subtle and different things to say about how to study it. Right? We can say some very general things about how to gain knowledge, but they're not going to be specific enough to help us in these particular cases, I don't think. I think there are, to some extent, this again to come back to the medical case with the RCTs and the patient testimonies and so on. I think there are disciplines, as you say, the kind of qualitative, quantitative contrast, where there really are disputes about what's the best way of finding knowledge about this particular domain. And I think one thing the epistemologist can do there is not just give us the right answer, but it can help us separate out confused questions, or to say, what do you mean this, what do you mean that? Let's try and break it down a little bit, and also to think about whether we really have to choose. My view often in research is that having a multitude of researchers with a multitude of methods can be a good thing. Right? We find out different things through different methods. I mean, that's tricky when it comes to something like medicine and drug licensing. We have to either license the drug or not. We can't just say, well, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom. But in other contexts, when there isn't such a sort of hard and fast decision to make, that might be the right approach.
Yes, follow-on question to that thing. Would it be correct use of the terminology to say the quantitative versus the qualitative approach are different epistemologies?
Yes, the question was whether we might then say that the quantitative and qualitative approaches were different epistemologies. Yeah, I feel like I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone here because I don't want to be pronouncing about other people's disciplines. But we might say, at least that they embody different epistemological attitudes or approaches. I mean, it depends, right? So there are some people who think of themselves as qualitative or quantitative who are very dismissive of the other, but there are also people who work in one way or another who are very welcoming of the other approach and a bit more pluralistic. So it would perhaps partly be a question of whether you thought that there were different ways of getting knowledge or that your way was the one true way. But when we're discussing these things, certainly what we're discussing, I think, is epistemology. What's the best way of finding knowledge about whatever it is we're interested in?
This is a very interesting question in certain digital humanities fields,
right,
where my background is in literary studies, and where you might be gathering masses of quantitative data, and your colleagues in literature say, that's not what we do, you've been counting grains of sand. So it actually is a really live question,
yeah,
the kind of epistemological.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose for me, I mean, again, speaking from outside that area, I mean, I guess one question I have then is whether you're using different methods to try and answer the same question, or whether really you're saying, well, look, here are these other questions that are also interesting, and maybe this isn't a method for answering the traditional questions in literary theory, but it's a way of answering some other also interesting questions.
Yeah. This speaks to some questions that are coming through on the board, and there are actually quite a few of them. So I know there's a lot more. I'm going to try to kind of bring some together because they're actually speaking to similar issues that kind of follow on from what we're discussing. And the question that starts this chain is the question: doesn't all knowledge have impact, almost by definition? Is it the problem only where policy wants to direct toward faster and more economically focused impact, which is related to the question of kind of medical research, right, which is very impactful, but it's probably not the kind of work that we're doing in the arts and humanities for the most part. So then we need to justify the value of our knowledge in relation to something like a drug patent, which is problematic in some ways. And the kind of follow-on here, no, there's no, so I'm going to pause.
Okay, right, so I mean, what I was gesturing at right at the end there, when I sort of tailed off with Masa on the handout, was a sort of frustration, not with impact in the wider sense, but in sort of certain definitions of impact that we're required to pursue. And in particular, I think some people have been concerned around the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, which assesses research policy in UK universities, with the emphasis on showing that something. The worry was that impact, it wasn't enough for impact to show that a lot of people now knew more about David Hume, for example, or a lot of more people had now heard about Toni Morrison. You had to show that had then, they'd gone and had done something different in their lives as a result of that, which of course, I think one's life is changed by reading Toni Morrison or David Hume, but not in a way that one can necessarily quantify. So I suppose what I was trying to do, and perhaps is agreeing with the questioner there, which is to say, well, look, by sharing our knowledge, that is impactful, even if that enriches people's lives without us being able to say that they had a better drug as a result of that.
And several people have suggested that one way that's useful for them to think about knowledge is to think about the process of producing knowledge as itself the thing that is to be valued.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's really interesting. So in case anyone didn't hear, so the question was whether the process of producing knowledge was itself valuable. I guess either as well as, or perhaps even instead of the end product being valuable. Yeah, I mean that's a great question. Right? So I'm just thinking on my feet here. I guess some of these distinctions again, I would want to say, well, okay, what do we mean? Is it valuable for its own sake? Is it valuable because it's useful for other things? I mean, what I'm tempted to say is, what makes it valuable is you get some knowledge at the end of it rather than the. But I think that's probably a bit too simplistic. I mean, one thing that's interesting about research, right, is often we do it, especially if you do archival research or certain kinds of research, you don't know what's going to be a dead end and what isn't, right? You do the stuff, and some of it works out and some of it doesn't. And there's two ways of thinking about that. In retrospect, we might say, well, looking back, that whole month of March was a waste of time because it led to nothing, whereas the research I did in April was really valuable because it produced knowledge. Or we might want to look back and say, well, that was all valuable. That was all part of the process of producing knowledge. And so even the stuff that was in some sense a dead end or a mistake had some value in its own right. So I think that's, if I was going to be thinking about this further, that's the question I'd be thinking about. I'd be saying, well, is the process valuable only when, in fact, it does produce knowledge, or does it also sometimes have value for its own sake? I mean, I'd like to say, one answer that philosophers have given to why knowledge is valuable, it actually turns that on its head and says, well, knowledge is valuable because it's the result of a valuable process. So it's the process of acquiring it that has value. It's an idea that goes back to Aristotle in some ways. It's an exercise of one's own skill and competence. It's an achievement in the world. That's part of the good life, part of a flourishing life, is to sort of exercise your skills in the world in that way. And that's why knowledge is a good thing. It's one of the things you get when you do that kind of human flourishing activity that we call acquiring knowledge. So yeah, we can either think of the process or the product as what's primarily valuable, or indeed both of them.
One of the points you mentioned here that knowledge requires justification.
Mm-hmm.
What I believe, okay, that there are a lot of things in our life, okay, from a very small insects, okay, to dinosaurs, okay, think about them, that they were in the long time ago, that these are knowledge, okay, but sometimes we cannot justify their existence. Okay. For example, I'm Muslim, okay, I believe in God as a Christian and Jews, okay, but we cannot justify the existence of God just because we are here. So here, my question is, a knowledge could a knowledge be a belief? And if you say yes or not, so what's the difference between these two knowledge?
Yeah, okay, that's great. Yeah, so the question there was about the difference between knowledge and belief, and also pointing out that there are certain things that so one example was belief in God, that it can be something that's really central to people's lives, and yet it's not the kind of thing, well, for many people they don't feel it's the kind of thing that they need to justify. It's just part of how they see the world. Or it would be a kind of mistake to think of this as something needing justification. Let me speak about that, then I'll pick on the other things you said. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure in the Islamic tradition as well, but I'm more familiar with the Christian tradition, there's a lot of discussion exactly this, right? So, do we have knowledge of God? Is faith a form of knowledge, or is it something that we have instead of knowledge, something that's better than knowledge? In connection with my own research, people talk about trust and knowledge in the same way. I mean, of course, there have been people who've tried to give arguments and evidence for the existence of God, but that's not the only way. I think some people think that they do have evidence for God's existence, and that is justified. So, yeah, I don't have a view myself there, but that's really a central question for philosophical thinking about religion. But the other cases you gave, in a way, were more mundane. You said, well, I know about the dinosaurs, or I know about insects, all sorts of things I know. But if you ask me what my evidence is, I couldn't tell you now. So the question there was, I suppose, challenging the difference between the connection between knowledge and justification. I think that's right, especially when a fairly large part of what we know because other people have told us, and we don't check, typically, right? And probably now we don't even remember who it was that told, what book it was. Again, this is a familiar experience of research, right? If you don't organise your notes, you know you read it somewhere, but where did you read it? I think that's right. So there's a question there. So one, a sort of strict response would be to say, well, then you don't really know it, okay, because you didn't keep track of your evidence. But that's such an extreme response, right? That would mean that we hardly know anything. So instead, my view would be that we need to come up with an understanding of justification, which says, well, you are justified in believing in dinosaurs, right? You didn't just invent that, right? Although you perhaps don't have first-hand evidence at your fingertips, that's something you've touched in TV documentaries or whatever. That's enough. But justification doesn't have to be overwhelming evidence. It can be at least some reason to think it. You have more reason to believe in dinosaurs, let's say, than you do to believe in space aliens or leprechauns or something. And we have to be able to kind of more modest about what justification requires, I think.
And if you don't mind, I also think that people, generally speaking, about people, they treat as if opinions, ideas, their claims as if they are facts and knowledge. Okay? Even though a researcher, he sometimes claims this is from the start, and then when he just did the idea, he is supporting, without any real evidence, he thinks that this is the knowledge and this is the fact.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here, I think people, for example, I give you an example, just to simplify my argument. That linguists, for example, look at language differently from people, for example, say, we think that French is the language of law, and German is the language of efficiency, right? Mm-hmm. But these people try to say these languages are different, and this language is more beautiful than the other. But in fact, languages that have the same, all of them, they've got these three components: grammar, pronunciation.
Yes, I think so. What the question is drawing attention to, that I think is right, which is that there are many things, I guess, which are considered kind of common knowledge, or many people believe them, or we think these are things we know. And in fact, that's one role for science and for research more generally, is sometimes to undermine what's thought to be common knowledge. I think that's right. So this is what we always, there's a balancing act here, right? Because we don't want to set the standards for knowledge so high that it becomes almost impossible to know anything, right? But at the same time, particularly in the context of our research, we want the standards fairly high, right? We want to be rigorous, and we want to be reflecting on our methods and our evidence and so on. And perhaps something I didn't get to today, but perhaps, it's interesting to think about particular responsibilities that we have as academic researchers in establishing knowledge claims might be, in some extent, the kind of evidence level required there might be higher than what we need in our everyday lives or for other purposes.
Thank you.
Yeah, this speaks directly to a response that I have on the board, which is reply to dinosaurs. Yes, we can be modest about justification, provided that the researchers promulgating the idea provide a chain of accountability through citations, etc., which others can, should they wish, verify. But this is interesting. We were talking earlier about paralysis and the kind of, endless turtle pile of lies that small children bring us, for example. But this gets to be a problem with justification too, because you can be paralyzed, it seems to me, by chasing down everyone else's justification, and there's a point at which you kind of have to. So what's that point?
Yeah, right. So
where you kind of throw up your hands and say.
I think we can't. As individuals, so sometimes philosophers talk about epistemic autonomy, but there are really limits to how autonomous we can be. Right? We can't. We can't run around checking all the references. This is one reason why, when there are cases of academic fraud in the journals and so on, it's so devastating. Is because there's an enormous amount of trust in the system that. It just would not be feasible for us to be checking everything. And even within the same research group, there's trust and so on. So when there are these cases of, often you hear more often about it in the sciences, but it can be kind of fake data and so on. It has huge ramifications, because once you start worrying about it, you don't know when to stop worrying. Right. But this is why we have. This is why within the academic sphere, where we have these standards of citation and peer review, and it's supposed to keep some kind of control on that and provide motivations for people to be honest and to keep track of their sources and so on. But it is true that nothing's 100%, because it's like with any kind of risk, right? often the more you try and eliminate risk in some activity, the harder it becomes to preserve why you wanted to do the activity or the value of the activity in the first place. Right? So, you know, where we're thinking about flying internationally or you know, crossing the road, right? We have to accept a certain amount of risk, and this is the kind of epistemic risk as well.
So this is speaking to, I'll take one more from the board and then open it back to you in the room, but this is speaking to a question that's come up several times in different forms on the discussion forum, and it's the question of the social aspect of knowledge. And this has come up in a variety of guises. So the question about situated knowledge, right? To what extent do we need to, and I'm scrolling down here to find the articulation, which was better than what I would come up with on my own. Aren't these different epistemologies, what Donna Haraway is describing when she talks about situated knowledges? The issue seems to be how we recognize or value these partial perspectives and facilitate dialogue between them. This carries on. I'm thinking about who or what is seen to be involved in producing knowledge. This is from another participant. From an ecological perspective, environments and non-humans can be understood to be participants in producing knowledge rather than knowledge being a purely human-made thing. And there are more questions along these lines. I'll read one more of them. Can you say something more about whose knowledge? I'm thinking about a female patient's knowledge of poverty, bodily, somatically, physically, and the male politician's knowledge. What does this say about how knowledge is gained and what is valued?
Well, these are all really great questions. And luckily, the next 9 lecturers will I hope.
A little stash of questions about situated knowledge because they've been pouring in.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I think that's exactly right to bring those questions up. And depending on the kind of research you're doing, that can be the kind of knowledge that you're trying to produce. And I'm serious when I mean that I think that future weeks that we'll be coming back to many of these issues. And I don't know whether Haraway will feature again, but there's certainly these ideas about kind of situated knowledge and so on. So what can I say in just a minute here?
Sorry.
No, it's great. It's great to hear that people have been prompted to think about these things. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I'm just trying to think something sort of insightful to say here, but I accept to say yes, absolutely, context and environment and who one is, and so when right at the beginning I talked about epistemology of ignorance and Charles Mills. There's that's one important example of some of these ideas, right? That what you can know and what seems obvious to you and what seems like good evidence can very much depend on your place in society, whether that's your racial identity or gender identity or just the amount of political power you have, as some of the questioners are bringing out. I mean, there are different sorts of responses. There's different ways of kind of theorizing those phenomena, which I think are undeniable. So one is to say there's a kind of body of there's a body of facts that we're all trying to find out about. A single body of facts, and depending on where you are, you have different perspectives on them, different access to them, and that it's important to recognise that in the feminist tradition, often people think about standpoint epistemologies. There's different, from different perspectives, one can see different parts of the elephant, as it were. But a more radical view here would be to say, well, no, there isn't a single elephant that we're all looking at, right? From different perspectives, there are different things to know, and there is no way of unifying these things together. I'm more inclined towards the single elephant point of view, but I know there are very good reasons also to take the other points of view. I think, I mean, the practical question there is to think about, well, how do we? To me, it's not enough to say, well, the politician has his point of view and the female patient has her point of view. We want to try and do something to get the male politician to appreciate something of the female patient's point of view, even if it's not possible to appreciate the whole picture from her perspective. So I think it's important to recognise the situationness of knowledge, but not to let that be a reason to just say, okay, that's how it is. We don't need to try and bring people together more.
Well, this comes back to the thing you mentioned earlier about relativism. That what it seems like we need is a difference between different elephants and all the different elephants you could possibly want, including Holocaust denial.
Right.
So the question is, can we distinguish between situated knowledges and all-out, full-blown relativism in this sense?
Well, this is, if I knew the answers to all these questions, my career would be, I'd be jetting around the world. No, seriously, I mean, these are really important issues, and I think you can see, once you start thinking in epistemological terms, you see, for example, a lot of these, a lot of stuff that's been in the media in the last few years about victims of sexual abuse and reporting historic abuse and what to make of victim testimony there, and how to think about standards of evidence and how to treat people and how to believe people and make people feel encouraged, and yet also have a fair trial and so on. Those are quite concrete examples of some of the concerns we're talking about in more abstract ways here. And in a way, just as with we said, well, in some of the medical cases, in the end, either you license the drug or you don't. In these sorts of cases, when you have a legal context, in the end, either you bring someone to trial or you don't, and either someone's convicted or they're not. So that's why, although there are no easy answers here, this is partly why I feel, we can't give up on trying to sort of give some way of at least connecting these different knowledges and different standpoints, which is not to identify them and say it's just one nice big happy family, but also we have to find some way of bringing them together and comparing them, or at least weighing them against each other, because sometimes we have practical decisions like that to make, which are kind of heartbreaking situations.
Yeah.
Just to bring it down into the room.
No. Can I ask? Also, what I think, personally, that there's nothing called knowledge. What is the ability, to get evidence for others, because there are, as if you're talking about something which is relative, I can, for example, say that girl is beautiful and that guy will say, no, she's not, But because she's beautiful, because she convinces me, and she doesn't convince the other. And I can give a lot of examples of all of these things, For example, the prophets, can convince some people of the knowledge of the existence of God, and he couldn't, or she, persuades or convinces the others. So whether what he's talking about is real or not real, is it knowledge or not knowledge, whether it's true or not true. So it depends on the ability, to say there is knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't want to steal away from the lovely ladies' examples, but you're right. There's an important issue here about who gets to. There's in effect a kind of a sociological question here about who gets to call themselves a knower, who persuades other people that they know, who has the best rhetoric, who can bring people around to their point of view, and this is. In the scientific context, the sociologists of science study this, and this is something historians study, and so on, of course. I think that's the response you're pointing to there, to that kind of seeing that some people have a louder voice than others, and some people are more persuasive than others, some people have more power in the media than others. One response there is to say, well, so it's just all who shout loudest, right? But I think it's important to resist that, right? When I say, well, but yes, some people have more persuasive power than others. But that's, something we should struggle against sometimes, right? So and why should we struggle against? It's not just because it's nice for everyone to shout loudly. It's because collectively we're trying to get at the truth as far as we can, right? Without thinking that we can always find out the exact truth. But nevertheless, one reason we think it's problematic that there are unequal access to persuasive mechanisms is that we think that's bad for us as a whole. That's going to make it less likely that as a society we come to get the knowledge that we need. And people, I mean, political philosophers talk, or not just political philosophers, political scientists talk about this in terms of epistemic democracy as well. I'm thinking about issues there about how do we have an informed debate in society about the right way forward with politics. And I think we shouldn't just fall back and say, well, it's just all a matter of opinion. I think that's too easy, and I think that's problematic. It's more problematic for underprivileged people, in fact, than it is for the people who have the power.
Sometimes I make a problem, but what I'm thinking about is that's the knowledge, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Even though taste of coffee, okay, some people they say this is very good coffee or not, okay, it doesn't depend on the coffee itself. It depends on the person who tastes it.
Yeah. So what the question is saying is that there are some things where judgment seems to be, in some sense, a matter of taste, right? And that has to be right. So, I mean, so when you think about wine or coffee or anything, the connoisseurs, there are some people who are going to say, well, there's just an objective fact about which is the best coffee, which is the best wine, and other people are going to say this is just snobbish nonsense. And I think in each case, or humour is the same, right? It's like I said, well, this joke really is funny, even though you don't realise how funny it is. In each case, we can say, well, is that the right way to think about wine, or about humour, or about coffee, or about aesthetic value? And we can debate those in each case. But I think we shouldn't mistake that for the whole of knowledge, right? That doesn't mean that we should say the same thing about scientific knowledge or about knowledge in general in the arts and humanities either.
Sort of speaking to the issue of situated knowledge that came up, I was also wondering if you could talk a bit about, I guess, the changing temporal nature of epistemology. What was right, what was, the proper quality control at one time, then suddenly, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Time.
Yeah, great. So the question was about how, the talk I gave was very kind of atemporal, sort of outside of time, and the question is rightly pointing out that our ideas about what the right standards are for knowledge have changed over time. Again, I'm going to partly pop this forward to the other 9 lectures, some of which will be talking about different ideas from different periods of history. But, I mean, you don't like to note that, I mean, this is one, in the case I'm most familiar with, and thinking about the history of science, I thought that this is exactly something that's evolved over time, right? So what's the relative authority of texts from the ancient world that have preserved through the Islamic world and came through back to Europe, as opposed to what you see with your own senses? How should one do an experiment? What's a good experiment? How do we weigh experiments against authority? Who is, I'm going to recommend Stephen Shaken's book about the social history of truth. Let me recommend that to everybody. It's a wonderful book about how issues about honour and gentlemanliness and scientific knowledge all got kind of wrapped up together. So whose word can we take? Whose word can be trusted, and so on. Yeah, for sure these ideas change. I think they are. I mean, Katie mentioned the digital humanities. I mean, right now with big data, things are changing extremely quickly. Like, how do we? And perhaps some of you may have seen some of this discussion of the replicability crisis in psychology, or kind of issues about the kind of how do we, when we have this huge amount of data. So I'm muddling both the issues here together, but I think as technology changes in particular, but also as culture changes, we have different possibilities for finding knowledge, and that forces us to rethink, well, what's going to count as knowledge here? If you've got this enormous amount of data and you just go in and you pick out the stuff that suits you, how's that similar or different from doing it and kind of more controlled experiment and so on? And these are really live issues. So I'm no expert on how these ideas in fact have changed over time, but for sure they have. And so it's important to remember that the period we're in is just another period, right? There's a kind of cultural contingency to how we think about these issues at the moment that is going to seem very different in years to come.
I think we're about out of time, actually. And our live stream is going to automatically, mysteriously, and without my control, going to shut down. So we actually need to end on time. So I want to thank you so much for a really, really engaging lecture, and there's more waiting here to be addressed. I want to encourage all of you, first of all, thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for taking part in the course. We're really excited about it. I want to encourage you to keep the conversation going on the discussion board. That will not close or shut down because of mysterious, the ontology of the internet or whatever is causing that. Yeah. Anyway, I want to thank you for coming. Professor Hawley, thank you so much for your lecture.
Well, thank you, Katie, for organising absolutely everything. And goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye.